Hi everyone, I'm Gerald. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can get started with miniature painting using watercolors you have at home, using easy to follow steps to paint any kinds of miniatures that you have. And I'll be showing you how I painted this miniature. There are a few advantages when it comes to using watercolors. The biggest advantage is that if you already have some watercolors at home, you don't have to buy acrylic paint to paint your miniatures. This is a big plus point, especially if you're just exploring the hobby or if you only have a few miniatures you like to paint. Also, if you're painting miniatures with watercolor, you can easily fix any mistakes that you make. I'll show you what I mean later in the video. These are some of the miniatures I've painted with watercolor using the steps that I'm going to show you. Hopefully, this will give you a good idea of how your miniatures will look like after you've painted them. As long as you have a watercolor set that's not too shabby, you will have all the colors you need to paint any kinds of miniatures that you have. Here are the watercolors I'll be using to paint this miniature. They are from Winston & Newton and De La Rowley, but you can use any brand that you have at home as long as they're not from the dollar store. You will want a good variety of colors so that you can mix any colors that you need for your miniature. So you will need your primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, as well as white and either black or dark gray. For reference, the colors that I'm using are Payne's Grey, Ultramarine, Viridian, Lemon Yellow, Yellow Ochre, Cadmium Red, Alizarin Crimson, Burnt Sienna, and Titanium White. To get started, it's a good idea to wash the miniature with water while scrubbing it gently with a toothbrush and let it dry. After that, if you see any more lines on the miniature, you can use a penknife to gently scrape them away. Next, it's time to mount the miniature. Mounting the miniature allows us to better hold on to it while we're painting it. To do this, we'll need some blue tack and a small container. Place some blue tack under the base of the miniature. Press the miniature and container together and give the model a little twist. The twist will help the miniature stick better to the container. Whether you are using watercolor or acrylic paint, you will need to prime the miniature. The primer will cover the miniature with a matte, even surface that helps paint to stick to your miniature. Because we are using watercolors, which is more transparent compared to acrylic paints, we'll need to use white primer. I'll be using the brush-on primer, which means I'll need to brush on the primer by hand. Alternatively, you can use the spray can version. Give the primer bottle a good shake and squeeze a couple of drops into a container. It's a good idea to use a container that you don't care for very much because any unused primer will dry up and it's not worth the effort to scrub away the dried primer. To prime your miniature by hand, you can use any regular brush. Dip the brush into the primer and start covering the miniature with a thin layer of primer. We don't need to be very precise in this step. Just make sure the entire miniature is covered with a thin layer of white primer. If you see that the primer is pooling in the recesses of the miniature, use the brush to move the excess primer to another area of the miniature. Once you're done, let the miniature dry for around 10 to 30 minutes in a well-ventilated area. When the primer is completely dry, give the miniature a quick check to see if you've missed any areas or if any area requires another layer of primer. Once the miniature is primed, we'll need to cover the miniature with a thin layer of white paint. Because we're using watercolors, which is more transparent compared to acrylic paints, this layer of white paint will help to make our subsequent layers appear more vibrant. For this step and the rest of the painting process, we'll be using a small brush with a pointed tip, something like what I'm holding here. Dip half the brush into the water pot, we don't need too much water for this, and brush it against the titanium white paint to load the paint onto the brush. Now we can apply the white paint onto the miniature. Just like what we just did with the primer, I'm covering the entire miniature with a thin layer of white paint. If the white paint is too runny, dry your brush, let the runny paint on the miniature dry, and repeat the process again. Once you're done, your miniature should look like a tiny marble statue. Now it's time to start painting the miniature. We'll start by painting the boots using the burnt sienna paint. If you don't have burnt sienna, you can use any brown color that you like. Dip half the brush into the water pot, remove excess water from the brush, and load the burnt sienna paint onto the brush. Now I'm going to paint the boots. You can see how the paint will pool a little in the recesses of the boots, which gives them a nice bit of depth. Feel free to rotate or angle the miniature so that you have a good angle to paint them. Once the boots are done, we can move on to the face and hands of the miniature while we let the boots dry. Actually, hold up. At this point, I'm going to deliberately make a mistake by painting some of the burnt sienna onto the pants, and I'll show you how easily these mistakes can be fixed. To remove the burnt sienna from the pants, clean the brush by washing it in the water pot, and remove the excess water from the brush. Now that the brush is damp but not wet, use it like a mop to soak up the paint. Wash the paint away from the brush, dab away the excess water, and continue to mop away the paint until you're happy with the result. If the paint that you want to remove has already dried, don't worry. Just use the same method mentioned earlier and repeat the steps a few times to remove the paint. Now we'll paint the face and hands of the miniature. I am mixing lemon yellow and yellow ochre to get a flesh-colored paint. Alternatively, you can mix a tiny bit of red into yellow paint to get a flesh-colored tone. Paint the face and the hands. Be careful to not let the paint pool too much or we'll lose the details of the face and the hands. If you make any mistakes, you can easily remove them. I'm not getting the flesh tone that I want, so I layered on some cadmium red followed by yellow ochre to make the flesh tone look more realistic. Once that's done, we'll let the paint dry. For the uniform, I'll darken the ochre yellow with a bit of Payne's grey. You can see how the paint is flowing into the folds and creases of the uniform, giving the figure some depth. Again, be careful and don't let too much paint pool into the recesses. With the uniform painted, we are halfway done with the miniature. Next, we'll paint the helmet and the vest. For this, I mix Viridian, which is already on the mixing palette, burnt sienna, and a bit of Payne's grey. With the helmet and vest painted, it's time to paint the gun. I'll be using Payne's grey for the gun. Here's a 360 view of the miniature. At this point, if there are any areas on the miniature that looks like it could use an extra layer of paint, you can touch up the miniature accordingly. Just be sure to let the paint dry completely before you do that. Lastly, I will paint the base of the miniature. If you don't want to paint the base, don't prime it and just leave it as is. For the base, I'm using yellow ochre to give the impression that the miniature is standing on muddy ground. Once the miniature is completely dry, it's a good idea to spray it with matte varnish to seal the watercolor. Use the spray can version, do not use the brush-on version because that will reactivate the watercolor. Here's a final look at the fully painted miniature. I hope this video has inspired you to try painting your very first figure. Don't worry about messing up. You can literally wash off the watercolor and start afresh. If you have a watercolor set at home, you just need to buy a fine brush, primer, and a matte varnish spray. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below and I'll see you in the next video.